Steve Keen does not need much of an introduction to this group. Here is one of his books, Debunking Economics, and oh my gosh, here, yeah. Well, wait, I got the one in between first. Can we avoid another fiscal crisis?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in about it's not out quite exactly. Is it 1 or 2 weeks yet or something?
Yeah, it's out in the UK right now, and it's actually #1 in political economy there. It's still about number 5,000 on Amazon, between 3,000 and 5,000. So I'm pleased about that. It's in the second print run already. This should arrive middle of November in the United States.
Okay, very good, very good. So without needing introduction, I would only want to mention Steve's, in the last several years, has worked on the Minsky model and modeling, and he's spearheading thinking and putting a lot together in various ways. And the other thing that Steve's just done recently, he's a candidate as a senator in the Australian Parliament, and so he'll give us a few words on that too, I'm hoping. And how does a monetary reformer get into politics, and what can a monetary reformer do? I'm hoping that many of us get into politics, and Steve can maybe enlighten us a bit there. But without further ado, our friend Steve Keen. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. I'll start talking before I start giving my my usual, I'm like PowerPoint. Without PowerPoint, I probably die. One person, people are being admitted to the room here, so I'll just actually click on that occasionally when that happens. Yeah, so just in terms of the book, first of all, this is my latest contribution. Rather than trashing neoclassical economics, I'm trying to come up with an alternative. Of course, the largest chapter in this book was on money. And as Stephen mentioned, I've been developing computer software to enable the monetary system to be modeled. So that's called Minsky. It's open source, it's free. I would be delighted to have monetary reformers download a copy and start using it, because it's designed to model monetary dynamics. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about one issue I want to cover, that I think we need a new form of money because of climate change, and I want to talk about that. It's actually quite consistent with what the AMR is trying to achieve, because it will fundamentally have to be a government-created form of money. And it will actually, we have to work out how it interacts with private money, but essentially, I think for the sake of enabling us to tackle climate change, it's vitally necessary. I'm going to just ask a question here before I get going. And I will not hold any personal judgment whatsoever of anyone for what they answer to this question. But I'd like people to raise their hands. There's a reactions. If you want to do that, there's reactions where you can raise a hand, and there's a thumbs up on that. And there's a yes and a no, a tick and a cross. So I'd like to know how many of you think global warming is a hoax. If you think it's a hoax, click the yes. If you think it's not a hoax, so it's real, click the no, okay? Okay, we're getting us to look through and here, see what we've got here. So that's a substantial majority saying no, therefore it's real, it's not a hoax. Congratulations, you're correct. The ones who think it's a hoax have been themselves hoaxed by mainstream economists. And I want to explain partially what's going on there, as well as, you can put your hands down now, by the way, if you just cancel those reactions, that'll make it easier. So those who thought it's genuine are correct. Those who thought it's a hoax have been fooled by mainstream economists. Now, of course, you all know you're critics of mainstream economists in money. So it's rather dangerous if you think they're wrong in money, but accept what they're talking about in climate change, because they're the ones who are saying a massive increase in temperature will cause only a minor fall in GDP. And I want to just I'll start sharing my screen now. And let's go to the particular, this is not the presentation I'm going to give, but this is a recent paper. I mean, literally recently, as it was published about 2 months ago, coming out from some well-credentialed mainstream economists saying that tipping points, which are things which can be flipped from one qualitative state to another by an increase in temperature, if 8 of them go, then that will reduce GDP by 1.4% compared to what it would be if they didn't flip. Now, the 8 ones they're talking about are Arctic summer sea ice. So imagine no summer sea ice on the Arctic at all. Greenland ice sheet, gone. West Antarctic ice sheet, gone. Indian summer monsoon, gone crazy, because it would be much more dramatic. Thermohaline circulation, that's what keeps Europe warm. That'd be gone. Permafrost gone, and even what are called methane hydrates, which are methane under enormous pressure at the bottom of the ocean floor, that a gigantic amount of methane, if that was released into the atmosphere. And they're saying the impact of all of those would be to reduce GDP by 1.4%. Now, frankly, anybody who concludes that is a lunatic. However you reach that result, you're crazy, because that would be a completely different planet to the one that we're on. And I have another presentation, which I've given, you can find on my Patreon website, which goes into detail why this is simply crazy. But that is the sort of work that economists are doing, which is being used by climate change deniers to say climate change is no big deal. At the same time, scientists are saying anything more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, over pre-industrial is very, very dangerous, and 2 could be degrees, which is about, say, 4 degrees Fahrenheit, would be catastrophic. But what's happened is economists have actually won the intellectual debate. So they've managed to persuade everybody, not everybody, but certainly politicians, bureaucrats. And if you think about the oil companies and the coal companies as fighting against climate change for self-interest, they're the ones who are shooting the guns, but the bullets have been crafted by neoclassical economists. And I won't go into detail why those bullets were made, and just given what we're going to talk about today. But that's the background. They know less about climate than they do about money. Let that sink in, first of all. You know how ignorant they are on money, okay? But the whole basis of the AMI is reforming the monetary system. And the key obstacle you've had for so long is the neoclassical economists who teach virtually everybody else how money functions don't understand it. They continue treating banks as financial intermediaries that don't actually create money, when we know they're originators of both money and debt. So they've been major contributors to a battle we've had to make to get sensible monetary reform, because most people have an understanding of the monetary system which is simply false, which leaves out the damage that private money can do. Well, they're to blame for that, and they're equally to blame on climate change. And this will give you an idea of how far they've infiltrated into policymaking. You all know the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The 2014 report, the economic section, had this frequently asked question: are other economic sectors vulnerable to climate change too? This is the answer. This is in the IPCC, by the way. Activities such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries and mining are exposed to the weather and thus vulnerable to climate change. Other activities such as manufacturing and services take place in controlled environments and are not really exposed to climate change. So what they're saying is a roof will protect you from climate change. Now, there's people in a couple of German villages would like to have an argument about that, because their roofs in their houses and half their village got washed away by superstorms. But that's what they've convinced. This is the bullets they've fed to the people who want to deny climate change. Now, I go in great detail in this paper, which is linked in the presentation, and I'll send it the presentation after I finish to Stephen, to show you just how bad their work is. But the fundamental thing, and I want to emphasize this as well, is even though what we do is focus upon carbon dioxide. That's been the obsessive focus. That really comes out of the economists themselves focusing just on CO2 and just on temperature change. So they agree that increasing CO2 will increase the temperature, but they've ignored all the other elements fundamentally of what climate change is about. Now, those other elements include things like how toxic is the environment, and the ocean, which is absorbing about 90% of the carbon dioxide, is building up large amounts of carbonic acid, becoming more acidic, and therefore breaking down the formation of shells, which relies upon alkaline components. So at some stage, shellfish won't be able to form shells. You can imagine the damage that it'd do to the food stocks in the ocean. So any of these could get us first. Ecotoxicity, biodiversity loss, eutrophication of water supplies, a crisis of water, both too much and too little, health effects, we're seeing that with COVID. But so they've made the complete focus on temperature. Now, when you look at what they're saying about temperature, they're telling us, just move this window out of the way, that 2 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels is nothing to worry about. Scientists themselves are terrified about 2 degrees Celsius, which is about 3.5, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Jim Hansen, who was one of the main people to raise the alarm way back in the 70s and late 60s, wrote a paper in 2015 saying how superstorms could be generated by a mere 2-degree increase in temperature, which could devastate Europe. Okay? And 2 degrees, not 6, 2 degrees temperature. Tim Lenton, who's become a research colleague of mine, again says that all these tipping points could be triggered by 2 degrees Celsius, even less, because one will cascade and cause the other ones to break. So again, 2 degrees is dangerous. Will Steffen wrote a paper saying that if we aren't careful, if we don't stay below a level, then we could fall into a process where one tipping point after another drives us to a much higher temperature level, which could be inhospitable for life in general, let alone for human life and let alone for human society. So at the same time, economists are blasé about 6 degrees Celsius. So this is that paper I mentioned a moment ago. Tipping points, and those 8 tipping points I mentioned beforehand. Imagine the planet without Arctic summer sea ice, without the Greenland ice sheet, without West Antarctic ice, with the permafrost gone, with methane hydrates gone. An incredible range of changes to the climatic system. They think it'll knock GDP down by 1.4%. And they're blasé, they mentioned 6 degrees of warming. So there's something incredibly wrong about what they've done. And equally, the policy they've advised is incredibly wrong, because their main policies are to say we should either have carbon pricing or we should have carbon taxes and compensate people who lose out of that. And the whole idea is to nudge the private sector via the price system towards sustainability. Now, that might have worked if we started doing it 50 years ago when the limits to growth first came out, but it's far too late now. We're very close to the precipice. There's no way the private sector can respond fast enough and effectively enough. And as we know from what happened in France when Macron put up a tax on diesel, ostensibly because of climate change, practically because he was trying to balance his budget, the Gilets jaunes movement occurred, and that carbon tax disappeared. So we need a monetary mechanism that is compatible with our existing system, because it's going to change it quite radically at the same time, could be politically popular. Rather than penalising the 99%, which is what Macron's tax did, it penalises the 1%. We have to put the burden of adjustment on the rich, and I don't necessarily mean rich countries versus poor countries. I mean rich people in rich or poor countries. The burden has to go on the wealthy rather than the poor. And it could hopefully work after we have a crisis, because frankly, I think because we've delayed for so long, we are going to see truly catastrophic climate change, something which makes what happened in Germany, what happened in the bushfires in the west of America, the flooding you copped in America from the remnants of Hurricane Ida, trivial, completely trivial, not even worth talking about compared to what's going to happen with the various factors that could go in climate change. So my proposal is what I call tradable universal carbon credits, or UCCs, to be distributed by central banks. Now, the idea, and I'm not the first to have this idea, by the way, I have to emphasize this, is that central banks would establish a universal carbon credit for all adult residents of a country. So you expect children below 16, okay, the parents have to take care of them, but above that, you enable adults to get carbon credits. And you distribute them on a daily or weekly basis, on a per capita basis, so everybody gets the same carbon credit. You and I get the same carbon credit as Rupert Murdoch. Now, you could set that if you wanted to, and I would argue for this initially for politically make it acceptable, set the allocation per person of the national average consumption of carbon. Then all goods would have two prices, a money price and a carbon content price. So when you bought something, you'd have to pay for the money prices you do now, but also pay for the carbon content of what you're buying. Now, once you've done that, if you're in the bottom 90 or even 99% of the population, if we set the average for America, let's say, for American consumption, then they would run out of dollars before they'd run out of universal carbon credits. So they'd have surplus carbon credits, and the poorer you were, the homeless would have the largest amount of surplus carbon credits to sell. The rich, on the other hand, would exhaust the universal carbon credits long before they run out of money in their bank accounts. And so they'd have to buy universal carbon credits off the bottom 90 to 90% of the population to continue whatever they were spending their money on. Now, this would be a way of course, and of course the price would be set by a market mechanism. So this would redistribute income and wealth directly from the rich to the poor. To be able to continue consuming or whatever, paying for their Learjets and everything else, the rich would need to buy carbon credits off the poor. It would be a direct transfer. You wouldn't need the government, except the fact it'd go through the central bank. It'd put pressure on consumption to move away from high carbon content towards low carbon. So, forget about your Ford car and buy an electric vehicle instead. And it would reward producers who have low carbon content to begin with. And this is not a new idea. As I said, when I first put the idea forward, a guy called Adam Hardy got in touch, and he has this website called carbonwatchdog.org. This is the proposal. So the same basic idea, a carbon currency for paying a carbon price on every carbon service, backed by carbon credits allocated on a per capita basis at a national level, and then tradable. Before I realised just how bad the mainstream economic work was, I was contacted by an Australian engineer called Denton Chen, and he developed the idea of global carbon rewards. He's still working on that idea. It's more complicated than what I've proposed here, but that's his website. So it's another alternative proposal, again, involving a parallel currency. And long before that, there was a UK proposal, what they call tradable energy quotas. This was actually submitted to the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And this was, again, the similar sort of idea. So it's been floating around for a while, but in some ways, the building up of digital technology, I'm no great fan of blockchain and Bitcoin and so on. But the technology has been improved for this sort of thing. Electronic accounts are much, much better than they used to be. So it's feasible to enable that system now in a way that wasn't quite possible if we go back 20 or so years. So what I want to do is give a brief outline of what the actual accounting would look like for this. And I haven't yet done a proper model. It's very, very complicated to do this. In fact, I have to redesign Minsky to support more than one type of money, which we haven't finished. We've started doing it. We haven't finished doing it. So I can't actually build a proper model. But this is laying out a table in Minsky. And imagine the carbon credits for the United States were 2,600, that's 2,600 gigatons, for example. Then you would distribute those to workers. So they would come out of the carbon credit of the country and go to workers. Equally, the capitalists come out of there. Then what would be happening, and I'll talk about this in a moment, workers would sell their excess carbon credits to the capitalists, and both would pay the carbon price to replenish as the fund overall here. So this is the creating universal carbon credits by fiat. Okay. Again, this is something which again is consistent with AMR's ideas. Distribute them on a per capita basis. Now, if we have a serious division of who's wealthy and who's not, then about 95% of us qualify as workers. We might be more well off than the lower down the scale, but only 5% make their money out of the ownership of capital, maybe even less. So 95% of the UCCs would go to workers, just 5% to capitalists. Of course, this would favour capitalists as a class. So if you imagine I had that 95% breakup, and let's say that there were 2,600 or million or billion, whatever, UCCs to be allocated, depending on what the units were, then 2,470 would go to workers and 130 to capitalists. Completely fair at the individual level, dramatically different to the normal distribution of income and wealth at the class level. So many of carbon credits for workers, very few for capitalists. Then you would then have both a monetary system and a carbon credit system. So this is looking at the capitalists' accounts. They have like 230 units in terms of money, but no universal carbon credits to begin with. Workers have got much less money, even though there's many more workers. So the capitalists pay both prices, run at both money and universal carbon credit prices. The workers pay both prices. Now, over time, the capitalists run out and therefore have to buy from the workers. And down the bottom here, I've got capitalists buying the universal carbon credits from workers to be able to continue their consumption. So it boosts workers' income. It would reverse the trend to inequality of the last 50 years. It would redirect consumption from high carbon dioxide products like private jets to low ones like food and services, simply because workers don't have private jets. Changing the distribution of income changes who can spend and changes the carbon content of what we produce. And it would encourage the design of low carbon content technology, because the wealthy consumers will want to reduce what they're paying. And the best way to do that would be to be able to buy products with lower carbon content. So this would be putting a rocket up the backside of capitalists to develop new technology with low carbon content in a way that a carbon price would not do. Nothing like it as effective. And the market, nonetheless, would set the prices. So even though this looks like a very different scheme to what economists have proposed, the economists are being econo-bureaucrats and trying to tell us what the right carbon price should be. They've been very accurate, by the way. Their carbon price ranges between -200 and plus $8,000 a tonne. Yeah, try to pick the right price in that range. Unmute, okay. Okay, so that's the basic proposal. I'll just quickly show the Minsky model I'm working on. And this is, I know this is something, I don't imagine many of you have had a chance to use Minsky yet, but this is the system. You basically design double entry bookkeeping accounts, and Minsky keeps track of all the accounts. One person's asset has to be somebody else's liability, et cetera, et cetera. So it lets you do a very detailed, very careful examination of the financial flows between 5 or 6 different sectors if you wish to. The only reason I haven't done this yet in Minsky is because this is supporting a different type of money, and I haven't yet built the technology to enable that in Minsky itself. We're working on that right now. So I'll leave it at that and take questions. Over to you, Stephen.
I'm muted. Yep, I'm here. I'm sorry. I had to unmute myself. First, Joseph Huber, I'm going to unmute you, and please, and then Sam Hummel will be next, followed by John Howell, and I'll unmute you as we go, and then Franz. When you're ready, Joseph.
Oh yeah, thank you. Hello, Steve. I just have 2 questions. Perhaps I missed something. What means tradable credits? Does this mean they are convertible in the other types of money, or are they usable immediately as a means of payment? And the other question actually is, who or what is the body issuing these universal units, the carbon credits?
It would be the central bank issuing it. Okay, so it'd be a form of central bank currency, and it would need to be decided at the political level. So you could, one reason we haven't had carbon taxes imposed is because it's all about let's get international agreement. And one reason the oil and the coal lobby like that is because they know that the international agreement will never occur. So I think we have to start this at the national level. You could have a national movement to bring this in, get it passed as a national law, apply it at the national level, and it would have a very dramatic impact upon your nation's consumption of carbon. And then, of course, that becomes part of the collective pressure. And if it works as well to initially make workers much better off because they would be selling their carbon credits to the rich, then I think it'd hopefully get political momentum in the rest of the world, which, of course, that's the last thing that carbon pricing or carbon taxes have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Sam Hummel, please. I've unmuted you.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, for the presentation. One of the things that I've been curious about watching a few of your videos is how much the model, like the Minsky model, is relatable to things like Dr. Yamaguchi's accounting system dynamics model. You're both, heterodox economists that are presenting macroeconomic models that challenge the mainstream neoclassical models. Are your two models, similar at root if you get down to it, or are they different?
Good question. The similarities are we both include money creation. And Akio's model initially didn't include endogenous money. He had vulnerable funds. We've actually met up at the one of the conferences in Chicago, and I said, well, you've got to change that, and he did. So he's compatible at that level now. His is much more traditional Keynesian in the way he builds his models. So my models are, there's two large classes. There's straight monetary models, where I look at monetary dynamics and then have the physical economy, if I add it in at all, as an afterthought in a sense. And there are others where the physical economy drives the whole system. And what I explain in this book is that it's possible to build model. Well, I'll backtrack a bit. Neoclassicals have changed the nature of their macroeconomics over the last 50 years or 40 years in the belief you must have sound foundations for macroeconomics. And what they've said is sound foundations is microeconomics. Now, their microeconomics is shit. Okay, if you read Debunking Economics, you know what I think of that and why it's justified both empirically and theoretically. The micro is crazy. You can't derive macro from micro anyway. So that's the wrong way to get a foundation. But what I show in the book is it's possible to derive my model of Minsky directly from macroeconomic definitions. So if you take the employment rate, which is how many people have a job divided by population, the wages share of GDP, which is the wage bill divided by GDP, the private debt ratio, which is private debt divided by GDP, those three together, you can derive Minsky's financial instability hypothesis from that alone. And then you can elaborate, you get price dynamics and multi-sectoral dynamics as well. So you can build a macro with macro foundations. And that's, as I'm saying, it's a different approach to Akio's, which is going back to the whole idea of Keynesian models, the multiplier, stock dynamics, et cetera, his approach is quite valid. I'm trying to make mine more based on an unarguably good foundation for macroeconomics, which is fundamentally taking macroeconomic definitions, dynamizing them, and then simulating them in system dynamic software.
Any response, Sam, or thought?
Well, that was very helpful for understanding the two, because I couldn't totally understand, you're both using the same, system dynamics software modeling, software Vensim, and have, I wasn't able to kind of figure out what the difference was. So now I think I understand it. I appreciate that.
Just to elaborate a bit, I designed Minsky rather than building an extension to existing system dynamic software, partly because I was required to by my funders, which was INET, but partly also because I don't like the interface of things like Vensim and iThink and Stellar. All the wires going everywhere, they look like what they call spaghetti diagrams. So I've tried to minimize that so you can pass values by definition, by variable, rather than just by wire. The equations are visible on the canvas rather than being hidden behind text boxes, et cetera, et cetera. The main innovation is the Godley tables, because when you try to build monetary dynamics, doing it with a flowchart, you get completely confused. It's impossible to follow the logic in a flowchart. If you make a mistake, you only find when you try to run the model. And you can build your own advanced checking systems on top of those to make sure you don't make a mistake. But try to show it to anybody else, they can't read it. Now, what I've used is the fundamental graphical user interface developed by accountants called double entry bookkeeping. So, and it's very easy to change the definition. It also makes sure your stock flow consistent all the way through. So that's the main reason why I've gone for Minsky. And it's also open source. So you can actually transfer Nakamoto's work across to Minsky. It'd take a lot of time to do it, but it would be a much more compact model because the financial dynamics would be covered by a few godly tables.
Okay, we're going to go to John, then Franz, and Greg. Thanks, Sam. Go ahead, John.
Right. Well, I certainly would like to thank you for this presentation, Steve, and I really appreciate your laying out the truth about the crisis, the ecological crisis that we faced, because it seems to me, I've had the same impression that people don't want to face it. And you're willing to spell it out in this way in the economic world, it seems to me is very, very helpful and very essential. My question you will find very naive because I have virtually no education in economics. But one of the things I heard you mention is in the Minsky model maintains this assumption that for every liability, there's an asset. For every debt, there's a credit. There's always this balance. And in coming into economics naively, from my point of view, I saw this in terms of bank statements. You always have to have the assets equal to the liabilities. And it strikes me that assumption, the assumption that's based on that is, for instance, a bank only has money that has been lent to it. And maybe that's not a correct economic interpretation, but that's what it looks to me like, in the sense that you have to have this balance between assets and liabilities. My own feeling is, from a realistic point of view, when I was young, I had more liabilities than I had assets, and now I have more assets than I have liabilities. And I don't quite understand why this assumption has to be that those two have to be equal. So why is it that assumption is made? And because, in a sense, what the ENIAC proposal, the AMI proposal is to create money not as debt. So you wouldn't have that equality. You would have creating money as an asset. So why this assumption in the analysis of all these economic things that those two always have to be balanced?
That's a great question. And what I want to do is actually, if I can give a few minutes here, I actually want to build a model using Minsky to show why you're mainly right and mainly wrong, but partially right. Okay. So give me a chance to do this. Hang on a second. Let's go and share my screen. So this is Minsky running here, and what I'll actually just change this back to being a bank. This is our bank icon. So I've created a bank icon. I'll call this the banking sector, or just the banks. And I've got the text wrong, but that's okay. This is the window for it. And what I want to show is, let's say here's the bank equity over here. That's the net worth of the bank. And it has reserves as assets. And it also has loans. And it has deposits. Now, what I might actually just include here is also have what I'm going to call savers here. Now, if you look at how the mainstream neoclassicals thinks, I'll just use an Australian technical term here, neoclassical bullshit, is that what actually happens is savers lend to borrowers. And notice assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. Okay. Now that's the neoclassical vision of loanable funds. And according to that model, lending doesn't create money. Okay. Now what we have out of is the real world. Let's call this AMI real world. is that banks create credit, which is on the asset side of their banking sector, and they add that amount to the deposit as well. I get the same balance coming out of it. This one, no money can be created. This one creates money and debt at the same time. Okay.
Right.
So that's the requirement that for every asset there's a liability does not rule out money creation, because money creation won't occur when you swap existing money, but when you create new loans, you create new deposits, you're creating money and creating debt at the same time. So that's the basic difference there. That's where your intuition is wrong. But your intuition is also correct in one way. And that's something I've just been working on right now, because think about a house, okay? A house is if you own a house, that's your asset. Now, whose liability is it? Well, the answer is it's nobody's liability. It's your asset, okay? So what we've, and this has just been a recent realization, which means we have to extend Minsky somewhat. So what we have to do is consider, I'll come across to, I'll put land in here as an asset of the banking sector. And a lot of the private, think about how private banks were actually formed back in the days, say, for example, of the private banking system back in the 19th century. They would have already be landowners that get the land valued in the new currency, normally a one-for-one equivalent with the old currency. So, greenbacks versus the British pound. And that would then give them a long-term equity, which would enable them to lend. So we're now doing this. We can say, well, land appears both as part of your equity and your asset at the same time. Okay. So I know this is getting a bit too complex for the question you asked, but both your points one is wrong, okay, because lending can create new money and create new debt at the same time. When you look at the, let's look at the, like running a deficit, for example. What happens with a deficit? Well, the deficit puts money in a deposit account, but what it does, rather than increasing the loans, you don't, when you run a deficit, the bank's assets that goes up isn't its loans, it's its reserves. Okay? So that is when you look at that and cascade through the system, who is that deficit a liability for? It's a liability for the Treasury, ultimately. Passes through the central bank. The Treasury ends up with a liability, but if you think about what the assets of the Treasury are, it's the country. So where I've got land over here, I'll put USA instead, and what value do I want to put on the United States of America? So in that sense, what the government does by running a deficit is this is what the modern monetary theory crowd's saying, they're quite right about it. By running a deficit, it's creating a surplus, identical surplus for the private sector. And the debt that it has itself is fundamentally debt to itself, debt in its own currency run through its own bank. So, but you could equally back that by saying this is equity. You could call that, rather than saying it's a debt, you could say, well, it's actually equity in America, et cetera, et cetera. So long answer, I hope that helped. I'll go back to the screen now. Yep.
We have Greg, Warren, Mark Pash. So there's a line, but we only got a few minutes, and I'm going to put Franz on. A quick question, Franz, and then hopefully we can get to one more, but let's go. Thanks, Franz.
Yes, the two comments. First of all, the UCC is basically an explicit, more explicit way of doing the fee and dividend system that was proposed by Hansen. So that is an observation and at the same time a question. But my real question is about the issue that also Joseph Haber raised. You see, you can't have currencies, whatever kind of currencies, without a proper architecture. And you answered him by saying, yeah, we can start on a national level, and that this collective power, it may come into onto the international level. But first of all, we don't have the time for all of this. And second of all, there is a proposition, there is a paradigm in which it's possible to have digital currencies by central banks, but central banks that are part of a federated global bank, a global Fed, which is sovereign and based upon on a federation, on a federal level, which bank would be placed in the United Nations, because the IMF and the World Banks, of course, are not part of the United Nations on account of the Bretton Woods system. And so my question then is, how do you see a digital international currency coming about internationally in a short kind of term, in a short kind of period? Because time is the essence nowadays with the whole climate crisis.
The extent to which there's an international monetary system is an interesting question. Obviously, the international monetary exchanges almost all going through the United States dollar and through the SWIFT system. But it's nothing like what Bretton Woods was originally supposed to do. And if one country had made a unilateral decision to bring in a parallel currency for itself, there is no way that could be blocked by other countries. You would have to do something about how you priced exports and rather priced imports. You'd have to have imported goods also having their carbon levels declared, which is a bit like the European Union standards, the CCC standards they currently use. That would be required, but you could enforce that as a condition of trading with your country. So I think it is quite doable. And the longer we continue blathering around about international this and global that, the longer we'll delay doing anything significant about climate change, because there's always one country, and I'll name it, Australia, that's going to block these things, or Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. You don't want to give the fossil fuel interests the power to block change, and they get that at the international level. They don't necessarily have it at the domestic level.
This is Stephen. We need to go on to the next guest, but our list here only gets longer. What I suggest is we digest everything Steve has shared with us, and that we make a proposal to Steve either through AMI or AFJM. In lieu of the urgency of climate change and in lieu of us coming together, I think we need to come together with Steve Keen and see how we can go forward together and to have these conversations. And I greatly thank John Howell for asking that questions, because I know we need to have a lot of dialogue here. And I thank you all very much. And thank you, Steve Keen, very much for being with us. And I hope you had a good morning walk too.
Yep, it was good. It was very enjoyable. Okay, bye all. Have a good conference.
Thanks, Steve. If this video was helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website